today was a great representation of the field of paleography at the moment, and in its very different aspects, and of things that are traditional and things that are changing. So the first session was on textual criticism. It was the classicists, and in some ways they were doing something very traditional. They were, I'm afraid, using their paleography to study classical texts only. That's very traditional. I don't know how many classicists think for a long time about the fact that there is at least twice as much medieval Latin literature as there is classical literature, and twice as much Neo-Latin literature as there is medieval Latin literature, and that medieval Latin after the Carolingian Renaissance is absolutely fine. So any prejudices you may have acquired by looking at 6th century Latin, you need to get away with. Nonetheless, you can see signs of great changes among the classicists. Clearly much more of an interest in the cultural context of the manuscripts that they were studying, implicitly an interest in reception, etc. So the situation is changing, and I think that's what Nigel Palmer, whose interventions were all extremely apposite, I thought, was getting at. He comes from a field which for a generation, almost a generation and a half, has linked textual criticism with reception, especially the Würzburg School of Kurt Ruhl. They were doing it in Oxford too, even when I was a graduate student in the mid-70s, but Würzburg, I think, was probably doing it first. And there, the idea of an edition as being recovering the author's text has been maintained, but in addition, it's taken for granted that an edition should show the whole history of the subsequent reception. Now this matters more for medievalists than it does for classical texts, or at least it matters in a different way, because sometimes a scribe who changes the content or the wording of a practical text or a work of pastoral edification, in a way is as interesting as the original author, whose identity we don't know anyway. Of course, sometimes the original author's is important, even if you don't know his identity. You remember they said that Homer's Iliad was really written by another person of the same name. But in fact, to be serious, the history of reception is something that is coming in, I think, to textual criticism with the classicists too. Then, in many of the other sessions, particularly in the second session, but also implicitly in others too, and the last one, it's clear that the history of the book and the history of materiality has become a really major force in paleography. The runaway success of the history of the book is one of the intellectual phenomena of our time. I remember when a course on an MA course on the history of the book was set up in London in, I guess, the 1980s. I thought, well, that's an obscure little subject. I wonder if that will get any students. And of course, in practice, it's become practically a discipline in its own right. And with Professor Wakelin's presentation and the others in the first section, you could see that the history of the book is right to the fore in the teaching of manuscript studies, and I think that's probably very generally true. And also, and this is more recently, I think, an interest in materiality. You know, we are being reminded that we are reading our scripts on dead animals, and that we need to think about those aspects of books. I was intrigued. I think it was Daniel Wakeling who said that we don't actually know where the sheep came from, and I thought that would be something worth pursuing, because it surprises me that we don't. Sometimes people exaggerate the cost of medieval books, and I say to them, well, every sheep has to die. And you probably don't kill a sheep just to use it for a book, but actually I'm just speculating. I mean, maybe you did. I assume you use it for meat or get wool off it until you're done with it. But still, those questions are ones that we need to answer. Then there was another category, and especially this was well represented in the last section, which was about how we communicate. And I thought the last section was wonderfully balanced between communicating by using actual manuscripts, close contact with collections on the one hand, and then the digital on the other. And there seems to be a lot more of both going on now than there used to be. So in all those respects, I think we're living in something of a renaissance of paleography in the very broad sense that it's defined. In the Neil Kerr Committee, which gives little grants for things to do with paleography, paleography is defined as pretty much everything except reading medieval manuscripts. And this is a symptom of how the subject is broadened out. Nonetheless, there were some sessions which were about how you actually teach reading medieval manuscripts, and Tessa Weber's session and Richard Sharp's interventions were focusing on that. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind and return to, bearing in mind especially, again, Nigel Palmer's comment that transcription is itself a work of cultural interpretation, and that Professor Wilson's comment that often you need to understand the text to transcribe it. Everything you said about Greek paleography is absolutely as true about the later Middle Ages. You cannot transcribe a text unless you know what grammatically the endings have to be. And the problem of languages, the philological competence that goes with paleography. So I hope we will come back to that. And then there were some wildcard sessions showing text and image, for example, and I think something that was flagged up was the need to bring, well, the fact that to some extent art history and paleography are being brought together, but that more of that is required, and that many of us who fancy ourselves as being competent in medieval manuscripts are conspicuously weak when it comes to the interpretation of images, and lack the sort of background expertise that we would take for granted when it comes to reading text. So, with that introduction, I'm going to now go back to the questions, and the first two I'm going to take together because I think they are roughly the same question.